Can't you hear it in your head right now? That sound. Gran Vals by Francisco Tárrega. Just 13 simple notes. For a decade, it wasn't just a ringtone. It was the soundtrack to life on Earth. It was played almost 2 billion times a day, every day. It represented connection, business, love, and the future. Now listen to the silence. How does a company that controlled 50% of the global market, a company that was the pride of a whole nation, whose cash reserves were larger than some small country's GDP, simply vanish? This was no slow decline. We're talking about a freefall. In 2007, Nokia was the king of the world, valued at almost $150 billion. Just 5 years later, however, its market share had collapsed, and its stock had lost 90% of its value. It was then sold for parts to Microsoft. They didn't just lose the game, they were erased from the map. And the terrifying part? They didn't do anything wrong in the traditional sense. They had the best supply chain. Their hardware was the most durable. They even invented the smartphone before Apple. So who killed Nokia? Was it Steve Jobs or Google? Or was it the man standing on a burning platform who was screaming for help that never came? This is the story of the collapse of the $250 billion company. It is the autopsy of the seemingly indestructible phone that met its end. In order to understand its demise, we must first appreciate its life. Before its downfall, Nokia wasn't just a tech company, it was a miracle. Emerging from the icy forests of Finland, a country previously renowned for timber and rubber boots, Nokia had transformed itself into the undisputed superpower of mobile communication. In the late 90s and early hundreds, owning a Nokia wasn't optional, it was the norm. Remember the Nokia 3310? It is the stuff of internet legend today, the indestructible brick. But back then it represented something profound: reliability. If you dropped a Nokia, you didn't check if the phone was broken, you checked if the floor was broken. They built devices that lasted forever. This philosophy, hardware and durability first, was the foundation of their empire. They mastered the physical world. They could manufacture and ship hundreds of millions of devices to the jungles of Brazil or the high-rises of Tokyo, and they would just work. By 2007, Nokia was selling more phones than its 3 closest competitors combined. They were the world's 5th most valuable brand, alongside Coca-Cola and McDonald's. The executives in Espoo, Finland, walked with the swagger of emperors. They had defeated Motorola. They had crushed Ericsson. They believed they had discovered the secret to eternal success. But in Silicon Valley, a storm was brewing. On 9th January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and took a device out of his pocket, the iPhone. This is the part of the story that is usually told incorrectly. People think that Nokia didn't see the iPhone coming. They think they ignored it. That is not true. Nokia executives got their hands on the iPhone almost immediately. They took it back to their labs in Finland. The engineers took it apart. The strategists analyzed it. Do you know what their conclusion was? They weren't scared. They were unimpressed. Why? Because they viewed the iPhone through the lens of a hardware company. They tested it and said, "Look at this. The call quality is mediocre. The battery life is terrible. It won't even last a day. If you drop it, the glass shatters. This is just a toy. It's a fragile toy for rich people. No one will give up their robust Nokia battery for this." They were right about the specifications, but wrong about the philosophy. Nokia thought people bought phones to make calls. Apple realized that people wanted a computer in their pocket. Nokia was obsessed with the device, whereas Apple was obsessed with the experience. While Nokia mocked the iPhone's poor battery life, they missed the revolution happening on the screen, the touch screen. In fact, Nokia had developed touch technology years before Apple. They had prototypes in their laboratories as early as 2004, but management killed them. Why? They calculated that touchscreens would be expensive to manufacture and might put off their core customers, who preferred physical buttons. They chose the safety of the present over the risk of the future. This is the innovator's dilemma in its purest form. When you're making billions of dollars selling phones with buttons, the idea of selling phones without buttons seems like financial suicide. So while Steve Jobs was inventing the light bulb, they kept optimizing the candle. But the real killer wasn't the hardware. It was the software. This is where the tragedy turns into a nightmare. Nokia's operating system was called Symbian. If you had a Nokia in the mid-2000s, you'll remember it. It was functional but clunky. It was a labyrinth of menus. When Google released Android in 2008, the game changed again. Apple dominated the premium market, but Android was targeting the mass market, Nokia's territory. Android was free and open and designed for touchscreens from the outset. Nokia's response was panic. They realized that Symbian could not handle the modern app ecosystem. It was like trying to put a jet engine on a horse and cart. The code was outdated and complex. Adding a simple feature required engineers to write thousands of lines of code. The most shocking statistic of the entire collapse is this. In 2010, Nokia was spending almost $5 billion a year on research and development. That was more than Apple and Google combined. Let that sink in. Despite outspending everyone, they were producing nothing but confusion. There were internal civil wars. One team was trying to patch up Symbian. Another team was working on a new system called Memo. Another team was working on Migo. The departments weren't communicating with each other. They were competing against each other. It was a bureaucratic monster. While Apple had one vision and one iOS, Nokia had a dozen visions and a chaotic mess. In 2010, the board of directors finally realized that they were in trouble. They fired the CEO and hired Stephen Elop, a Microsoft executive. He was the first non-Finnish CEO in the company's history. In February 2011, Elop sent a memo to all Nokia employees. It is now known as the Burning Platform Memo. It is one of the most famous documents in business history. He told a story about a man who worked on an oil rig in the North Sea. One night, the man woke up to a loud explosion. The rig was on fire. He ran to the edge of the platform. Below him was the freezing, dark ocean. Behind him was a wall of fire. He had to make a choice: stay on the platform and burn, or jump into the icy water and risk drowning. The man jumps. He survives. Elop wrote, "We are standing on a burning platform." He admitted that Nokia had missed the smartphone trend and the app ecosystem and was losing market share by the second. He said, "Our competitors aren't taking our market share with devices, they are taking it with an entire ecosystem." It was a brave admission, but the solution he chose is still debated to this day. He decided to jump. He announced that Nokia would abandon its own operating systems. No more Symbian, no more Migo. Instead, Nokia would base the entire company on a partnership with Microsoft. They would exclusively use Windows Phone. The announcement was catastrophic. By declaring Symbian obsolete before the new Windows phones were ready, Nokia was essentially telling the world, "Don't buy our current products, they're outdated." Sales of Nokia phones collapsed instantly. This phenomenon is known as the Osborne effect. Announcing the future prematurely kills the present. Over the next 2 years, Nokia attempted to make the Windows Phone a success. The Lumia series was stunning. The cameras were incredible. The hardware was colorful and distinctive, but it was too late. The world had already divided into two camps, iPhone and Android. There was no room for a third option. Developers didn't want to build apps for the Windows Phone because there were no users. Users didn't want to buy Windows phones because there were no apps. And developers didn't want to build apps for Windows phones because there were no users. It was a death spiral. Then, in September 2013, the inevitable happened. Microsoft announced that it was buying Nokia's mobile phone business for around $7 billion. A company that was once valued at $150 billion was sold for a fraction of its former value. During the press conference announcing the sale, the Nokia CEO reportedly ended his speech by saying, "We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost." And then he cried. Whether he actually said those words or not is irrelevant. The sentiment is the lesson. By the standards of the old world, they didn't do anything wrong. They managed their costs, improved their batteries, and made durable phones. But they failed to realize that the definition of right had changed. They thought they were in the phone business. However, Apple and Google knew they were in the internet business. While Nokia focused on connecting people via voice, the competition focused on connecting people to the world via data. The Nokia brand still exists today on phones made by another company, HMD Global. They are decent Android phones, But the magic and dominance of the era when a Finnish rubber boot company ruled the planet is gone. Nokia's decline is a stark reminder that success can be a terrible teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose. It teaches us that size doesn't protect you. In fact, it just makes you a bigger target. Look at your smartphone right now. Does it have a glass screen? It needs to be charged every night. It's fragile. Nokia's engineers would have hated it, but you love it. Because it's not just a phone, it's a portal. Nokia, the giant of the North, was locked out because they were too busy admiring their own handiwork, while the rest of the world simply kicked down the door. So the next time you hear that classic ringtone in an old film or find a dusty 3310 in a drawer, don't just feel nostalgic. Take heed of the warning. In the business world, the silence that follows success is the loudest sound.